Hello and welcome to podcast.init, the podcast about Python and the people who make it great. When you're ready to launch your next app or want to try a project you hear about on the show, you'll need somewhere to deploy it, so take a look at our friends over at Linode. With 200 gigabit private networking, scalable shared block storage, node balancers, and a 40 gigabit public network, all controlled by a brand new API, you've got everything you need to scale up. And for your tasks that need fast computation, such as training machine learning models, they just launched dedicated CPU instances. And they also have a new object storage service to make storing data for your apps even easier. Go to pythonpodcast.com/linode, that's Linode today to get a $20 credit and launch a new server in under a minute. And don't forget to thank them for their continued support of this show. And you listen to this show to learn and stay up to date with the ways that Python is being used, including the latest in machine learning and data analysis. For even more opportunities to meet, listen, and learn from your peers, you don't want to miss out on this year's conference season. We have partnered with organizations such as O'Reilly Media, Corinium Global Intelligence, ODSC, and Data Council. Upcoming events include the Software Architecture Conference, the Strata Data Conference, and PyCon US. Go to pythonpodcast.com/conferences to learn more about these and other events, and take advantage of our partner discounts to save money when you register today. Your host, as usual, is Tobias Macey, and today I'm interviewing Pete Fein about his voyage on the rising tide of Python. So, Pete, can you start by introducing yourself?
Sure. Thank you for having me. My name is Pete Fein. I'm a software engineer and consultant. Work exclusively in Python for almost close to 20 years.
And do you remember how you first got introduced to Python?
Yeah, I first got introduced to Python 2.1 around 2001. I was working in the trading industry in Chicago, and a coworker put me onto it for doing some interest rate modeling. And shortly thereafter, I started a startup as a CTO, as a job search engine. It was to kind of really cut my teeth in the language at that point.
And my understanding is that you have used Python exclusively in your professional life, and I'm curious if there are any other programming languages that you have been exposed to or experimented with and taken any inspiration from as along your journey of working in Python, or just some of your views on the rest of the programming community as somebody who has been using Python professionally for so long.
Sure, I'm somewhat unusual in being this experienced and only working in one language, and I mean that literally. Like, Python is the only programming language I know how to code in, and I can obviously read other things. But the advantage of being a language monoglot is that it's allowed me to be an architectural polyglot. I've worked on a whole range of different backend systems, front end systems, and by focusing just in Python, it's allowed me kind of to expand in other areas. In terms of other influences, I studied computer science as an undergraduate, and I did a little bit in high school, but the first class I did in the fall of 1996 was on Scheme, a Lisp dialect using the structure interpretation of computer programs. It's a kind of famous book called the Wizard Book. And despite having done basically no Lisp since then, that has more influence on how I think about programming and how I structure my code. And I should amend that a little bit to say that a year ago, I retook this class with David Beasley, who's been a friend. I've done maybe about a half dozen classes with him in Chicago, where what I had done in 13 or 14 weeks semester when I was 18 years old and kicked my butt, we did in the whole book in 4 days. And was certainly experience and kind of really interesting to go back to it. But yeah, and then I've drawn on sort of other language paradigms as things have gotten popular. Erlang was kind of influential for a little bit and thinking about some things, and async JavaScript. But really, it's been Python via Dave Beasley and the Wizard Book.
And so you mentioned that at the beginning of your career in Python, you were working in training, you've worked as a CTO, working in the web space, and my understanding is that now a lot of your consultancy is focused on the data engineering and data science area. So I'm wondering if you can just sort of give a brief overview of sort of the shape of your career and some of the main sort of verticals and problem domains that you've worked in.
Oh my gosh, sure. So like I said, I started out in trading, doing interest rate modeling, like trying to figure out how to price bonds, which is where I learned Python, and then spent about 6 years as the CTO of a job search engine vertical search startup, kind of similar to Indeed or Simply Hired, if people know those. And I feel like in some ways I have been repeating the lessons I learned during that time over and over again in whole or in part, both in terms of web development, which I did for a number of years, Django, Flask, a bunch of other frameworks. And then over the last 5 or 6 years, moving into more intensively into data engineering, um, really big data, supporting data scientists, data analysts, and sort of bringing a software engineering approach to data.
And along that journey, what are some of the projects that you have been involved with which you're particularly proud of or that you think were sort of milestones along your career?
Sure. Certainly that startup and the fact that, I got really burned out towards the end and kind of exercised my options and got on with my life. And I'm still friends with the founder, which feels like as much an accomplishment as anything. Since then, on the open source side, I've done a number of projects. The kind of most successful one was a logging library called Twiggy, which has kind of an interesting backstory. I was at PyCon in 2009 and was hanging out on the chat group and complaining about standard lib logging, as a lot of people do. And Jesse Knoller, the conference chair, was like, "You should write a new one." And I'm like, "Okay, I just, here's this guy. He's giving all of his time and energy to make this conference happen. And he's telling me that the most useful thing I can do right now is to write a new logging library. So maybe I should listen to him." And once I got into it, it turned out to be actually a really interesting problem domain. I really enjoy kind of like system level utilities. I joke that the kind of like code I like to write is, you say if name equals main and then import Pete's code, kind of things that cut across a whole range of different problem spaces. And so it was fun to take a look at that problem space afresh. Everything up to that point had been based on Log4j, the Java logging library. And we had learned a lot about how to structure applications in the intervening 15 or 16 years since Log4j came out. And that library got some use. It's sort of been an interesting experience for me as an open source maintainer. I really try to write code that works perfectly. It does what it says on the box. It has like 95% test coverage, and it just does it totally perfectly. Because there's just, both as an open source maintainer and then in my consulting business, there's like no profit in support. It's not fun. It's not a good way to make money. And so the problem with that library is I didn't know anybody was using it. It turned out there were like 3 or 4 third-party extensions people had written and put up on PyPI, and nobody got in touch with me. It got packaged by Debian and Red Hat, and I didn't know until I was like randomly Googling the project and found it in their repos. And I think I got maybe 6 bug reports in 10 years. And I don't know, maybe I should have left some more bugs in, because if I had known people were using it actively, I would have probably worked on it more than I did. And so, yeah, it's still out there. Some people are still using it. I talked to the author of StructLog, which is a add-on for standard lib logging, and he said he had kind of been influenced by the work I had done on that, and that felt like as much as an accomplishment as anything. I mean, that's success in my terms. Is I was really just hoping to reopen the space and kind of try some new ideas out. And so I'm glad some people ran with them.
Yeah, and there have been a number of different points where people have tried to reinvent logging for Python, and it's interesting to see the different ways that it gets approached. So there's the work you've done, there's StructLog, as you mentioned. A while ago, I had Itamar Turner-Trauring on to talk about Elliot, which is a different approach. There's the Logbook project from Armin Ronacher. So there are a lot of different ways that people have tried to tackle the same problem, but one of the limiting things is that for the most part, you do at some point need to be able to be at least one way compatible with the built-in logging library, because you need to be able to consume and propagate the log messages from your third-party dependencies as well.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly been the challenge. It's just one of these system-wide cross-cutting concerns that everybody has to use the same thing. It's like you can't have your own import system, right? It's just you have to support basically the whole universe of third-party and extension packages, and have some kind of compatibility or monkey patching. And I think that has really kind of kept us locked in on standard lib logging, which for its time was kind of quite powerful, but is sort of, I think, starting to show its age, and the performance is not very good. And it's in some ways, I think we're at the point where we've had a lot of ideas, and just that somebody or a couple people kind of need to kind of get down and just sort of do the hard, long work of getting something that supports a bunch of these different idioms, supports all these different libraries, and then doing the work of getting that mature, getting community uptake, and then working it into the standard lib library. It's not unlike the packaging dilemma of the last. I wish I could say it's done, but it doesn't seem to be. Of the last, I don't know, 5 or 10 years. Is that right? This is another area where everybody's got to use the same thing. Yeah, we've been fortunate that some people from the PyPA, the Python Packaging Authority, have really just been dedicated enough to kind of push that through, because it was really critical. And logging is important, but it just, we can continue to write programs that use standard lib logging, and it's basically fine. And so, yeah, I think it's tough to be motivated sometimes to do that over the long haul. And so I have a lot of respect for people who put that work in. I wish I had more time.
And another interesting element of your work on Twiggy is, as you mentioned, there have only been a small handful of bug reports over the number of years that it's been available. And so it's an interesting perspective on the idea of when software is done, because if you look at some projects on GitHub, for instance, it's easy to see something that hasn't been updated in a year or two and assume, okay, this project is dead because nobody's maintaining it. But on the other hand, it could just be that the project is done and there's no need to do any updates or maintenance because it works as intended, and there's nothing that has come along in the intervening years that has caused it to break. So it still functions as it did at the first time that it was written. So I'm curious if you have any particular thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I run the Python meetup here in Pittsburgh, and maybe about 6 months ago, we did an event I called Pete Picks a Python Package. And so just trying to teach people that when I go out and I'm trying to find a third-party library to use, what am I looking at? And this is a question. The ecosystem is so large and so complex, and this was one of these issues. Is I look at the GitHub activity, and is it done? Is it dead? Are people not using it? And so, being distinguishing between projects that have open bug reports or open pull requests that are just aging and not getting a response to, that project might be dead. But something that just doesn't have bug reports and starts, yeah, it might still be active. Other things I look at are there documentation? Are there tests? I like to look at some code and just get a sense of kind of the feel of like what people are doing. I tend to do this when I'm doing interviews, either when I've been hiring for a company, or just I do this sometimes for clients. As I do technical interviewing, is like I like to see some real code. And my favorite thing to actually look at is utils.py. Is that you learn a lot about a project or a person's coding style, about what they think utility functions are. Yeah, I think it's a far more effective way of evaluating a technical peer or a project, or than whiteboarding or kind of any other such silly thing. And it's like what we do all day is write code, and so like let's see something. Like, let's talk about that.
Yeah, the utils.py is an interesting thing as well, because there are some projects where there's a utils.py that's dedicated to that project, or you might have an entire module that you pip install for all of your utilities that you cargo cult across all of your different projects. And it's interesting how you figure out what are the dividing lines along that, and how do you package them so that you're not just bringing in a whole bunch of useless functions that have no bearing on the project at hand.
Right. I've used the bolt-ons project, which is sort of a play on built-ins, but is kind of a whole, dozen, 3 or 4 dozen kind of common recipes at this point. And so, yeah, it's just as the community and the ecosystem has grown and the tooling has gotten better for sharing code, it's just the amount of work that we have to do redundantly has reduced so dramatically. And I think it's sometimes useful, as particularly for people who are like coming up in their career, kind of earlier in their career, to go through the exercise of writing these utilities, or certainly reading how these things are written. But it's just the amount of high quality code out there that you don't have to go figure out and make the same bugs over and over again, compared to when I started in my career, is just amazing to me. Just how much more we're able to get done. It's just really, this was the point of free software. Like, this is the point of free software and open source, is that we can make a collective code commons that everybody benefits from. And it's amazing to see how that's actually panned out, how well it's panned out.
And that's an interesting thing, too, is that early on in the life cycle of a language and its community and ecosystem, it's very easy to have a significant impact on a broad range of people who are just discovering the language. So, for instance, Elixir is a fairly recent language that I've heard a lot of people having the same type of experience of it's a new language. Nobody has written the canonical ORM for it, so I can go ahead and be the one that writes that. Whereas if you're coming into Python now, there are dozens of ORMs. So if you write another one, it's just another ORM. So not as many people are going to see it or be as impacted by it. So I'm curious what your experience has been of somebody who joined the community fairly early, but not at the beginning, and having been engaged in helping to support and grow the community through running these meetups, how the sort of accessibility of the community and the ability to have an impact has changed over the years from when you started to where you are now.
Sure, I think that's a great question. I got first involved in the Python community and open source at the Chicago Python user group. And I say user group these days, and people look at me funny, but it predated Meetup, and when it was basically a self-hosted mailing list and a conference table, in a coffee shop. And I remember being about 25 and going to a Meetup, and there are 12 or 13 people there, and 3 of them are the core Subversion developers, which was the version control system everybody used before Git. And I'm just like 25, and I'm like, holy crud! I type Subversion like 100 times a day, and I get to hang out with you folks. And that was just a transformative experience for me. That wait, like these are just people, and they're just around, and they're just willing to talk to a young kid. And so I've really tried to kind of carry that spirit forward. I both, in sort of giving talks at PyCon and sort of helping involve in that. And then when I had the opportunity to take up the Pittsburgh meetup, which had gone dormant, just be able to pay that back. In a broader sense of accessibility, it's just the community gotten larger. We've become much more aware of what our community looks like and what we're doing to make it inclusive or not for all sorts of people. So when I first attended PyCon in Dallas in 2007, it was 96% men. And as a guy, like it was terrible. It was just terrible. This wasn't good for anybody. And just the strides we've made on that front, when I went last year in Cleveland, just looked around. I was like, it was like 35% women around. It was just like people. It was like just people. I was like, wait, this just looks like normal people. And I really appreciate the efforts the Python community has made on that front. This has been my home in open source for almost 20 years, and it's sort of spoiled me. I go to other conferences or I go to other language communities or whatever, and everybody is striving to be what Python is in terms of a community. And I really appreciate being able to play a small part in that.
And what are some of the other ways that the growth of the community and the way that it has evolved has impacted your career trajectory from working in trading to where you are now working in data?
Sure. I mean, at a technical level, the changes I've seen over this time are just amazing to me. So when I started, there was no cloud. I remember Amazon released this S3 product, which all you could do was static storage. Like there was, you wouldn't even like hang on. And I was like, oh, this is interesting. We can do something with this. To what's available now. There was no web story when I started. And I remember being at the Chicago group in around 2007 or 2008, and Ruby on Rails was eating our lunch. And these guys come up from Kansas, and it was the first public demo of Django. And we're all just like, oh my gosh, we still get to have careers. This is awesome. And then more recently, the growth of data as a discipline has been certainly interesting for me. So I've sort of been working in that space since I was doing the search engine in the early 2000s. And it's just seeing that applied in just all of these different domains that we can make concrete decisions. And it's really in the last year or two that I feel like data engineering as a subspecialty has kind of come into its own. That like I'm not a statistician, I'm not a data scientist. As I like to joke, it's been a really long time since anybody taught me calculus. And so I kind of understand it, but just like don't let me near a machine learning model. Like it's not I think. And so being able to bring a real like hard engineering focus to people coming from those backgrounds and to support them in the work they're doing has been really rewarding. I think career-wise, the big change over this time has been just the specialization across tech. That for what was for me was one job in 2003 is literally 5 or 6 different jobs now, from web developer, backend developer, data engineer, DevOps. I mean, we used to call that sysadmins. And it's just you kind of use like one person would do all of these things, and the ability to focus, I think, as the field has grown, has just kind of generally improved the quality of software and products we're able to produce.
Yeah, I remember probably 6 or so years ago at this point was when everybody was using the term full stack engineer to mean somebody that had to do everything from writing the JavaScript that ran in your web browser to writing the Django code that powered the web API to managing the database and figuring out how the overall system architecture looked. And as you said, there's been a lot more specialization as front end engineering is with JavaScript has become its own separate discipline because that ecosystem has evolved and gained a level of sophistication that it lacked early on. And the complexity of the web environment has grown, particularly with trends in DevOps and the move to things like microservices or using a lot of third party APIs to be able to stitch together an application. And then, as you said, the rise of data as its own discipline and needing to actually put a lot more rigor and engineering around how you manage the life cycle of the data and the data flows to ensure that it continues to be available and consistent and have the necessary amount of cleanliness and rigor that is necessary to be able to gain useful analytics from it.
Yeah, and the data side is still evolving, which keeps things interesting to me. You said that just as communities mature, that there's maybe less opportunity to have an influence. And I think that's true to a degree, but just as these engineering disciplines have gotten more sophisticated, there's an opportunity to both through your own, personal growth and as well as community development, work on those, as disciplines. And so yeah, we're still in the early stages of what software engineering means for data. And that's been interesting for me. And as a consultant, you kind of, I think this is true in any part of the field, but like you kind of have to keep moving. So 2012, I was doing a lot of Django and I can still do that, but just there's a lot more people who do that now. And it's allowed me to kind of continue to move in new directions. And I think one of the things that's so rewarding about being a software engineer is if you like learning new stuff, if you're the kind of person who's curious and self-motivated, it's just such a wonderful field to work in, is that just there's an infinite number of rabbit holes you can go exploring. And so I don't think that's going to change. I think as we continue to help software eat the world, like we're going to find more and more things that, like, even if it's all Python and like, okay, great, we've solved Python, we haven't solved Python, but as we apply that to more and more domains, there's going to continue to be opportunity to growth. I'm like really curious to see what happens with IoT and like physical devices. I've done some consulting work on, there's a whole bunch of self-driving car and like robotic startups here in Pittsburgh. And it's been a lot of fun for me to do things that aren't the web. I like the web just fine, but just, I've spent much of my career building the web or consuming the web or advertising on the web. And to go out and be like, wow, I get to work on things that move around in the real world. Or, I just did a little bit of project for a company making heart monitors. And it's like, wow, this is real stuff. Like, this is real stuff. And as we start to couple software with physical technology, the opportunities to, I think, really make a difference in meaningful ways in people's lives are just increasing.
Yeah, and another area of growth is on the higher level piece of things of making programming easier and more accessible to people who don't actually want to do it as a career and just want to be able to have some influence over the technology that has been permeating their lives, whether it's the smartphone or some of the smart home devices or their vehicles, and just being able to have some way of modifying the logic in these devices to suit the specific needs that they have and not just have to take what's handed to them as a prepackaged good that they're not able to look under the hood for, and moving programming and moving computational thinking and computational accessibility further and further up the ladder.
Yeah, it's just a really just powerful trend generally. One of the meetups I did here last year, there was a woman who presented on, she works on the Artificial Pancreas Project. And so this is an open source project to make a closed loop pancreas system. So she had juvenile diabetes, and the automatic insulin pumps that were on the market are just very primitive, like very, very lagging and stuff like that. And so people hacked the firmware and wrote, monitors that are kind of much more responsive. And I'm like, this is the promise of free software. Like, this is what open software is about, is people like building their own pancreas. It's just amazing to me. And I think the challenge as a community is just how do we welcome these people in? Is just more and more people get involved in, like, people who don't think of themselves primarily as coders. There's a pretty large community here in Pittsburgh of people who do computational art, and they're artists first and programmers second, if that's a meaningful thing to say. but programming is their paintbrush. And as more and more people get involved, it's just how do we continue to spread our culture? And I mean that both in a technical and social sense. Basically have people coming in don't know version control or testing or kind of all these kind of basic practices that we've developed, and how do we spread that? But then also just how do we spread our community values of accessibility, free software, stuff like that.
And your note on things like version control and basic engineering best practices is something that is worth talking about as far as you have moved through these different phases of your career and worked across these different verticals and problem domains. What are some of the constants that have been helpful throughout, and some of the areas that you see as being valuable regardless of where you might end up working within the software realm?
So obviously for me, Python. Python has been a constant. I keep getting tempted to learn other languages, and I just there's this joke in the Python community that's the second best language for everything. And that if you need to make a web page, maybe PHP is better. And if you need to crunch some data, maybe R is better. But if you need to crunch some data and put that on a web page, well, now you're doing two things. And Python excels at that. And so out in the real world, like we're often doing more than one thing. It's been really excellent. And so that's been just the big tool in my toolbox for nearly 20 years. What else? People. It's just as I get a little bit older, just the software, it's full of humans. And whether that's the clients or your employer and your boss, the business people, or it's the other developers, it's just it's surprising is that I think a lot of people get into technology because they're maybe a little less social, a little outgoing, and then you find that to really be successful that you do have to deal with the humans, and that it's really rewarding after a time. Beyond that, just the availability of what's out there in terms of best practices like logs or Stack Overflow, which is a relatively new development, relatively in the course of my career. Again, I think sort of reflects that community mindedness, is that we're trying to make something better. And it's just, that's what's so inspiring to me about working this area, is it feels like an area of the world where we can make some progress. We can make things better in small ways.
And on the other side of things, as you have moved across these different problem domains from web to data and working across the different communities that you've been involved with in your different roles, what have been some of the biggest differences and some of the biggest learning curves as you have moved into these different areas?
Sure. So one of the nice things I like about being a consultant is I do get to work in a lot of different verticals, and it's fun for me to learn a little bit about people's businesses or people's particular problems. It kind of keeps things interesting. On a technical side, moving from the web to data. Oh my gosh, I feel like it's taken close to 20 years, but the web is largely a solved problem. Not entirely, but just like database websites, like it took 20 years, we finally got it. And less so in some of the other areas. And so in terms of the domain, it's interesting, like a lot of web code or even like kind of systems code, like DevOps systems, there's both a right answer in terms of that, you can write a function in your web server and you can test it and you can like thoroughly test it. So like, this is like, there's an oracle. It's like, this is what this should do. And that's somehow coupled with a bit of a loosey-goosiness about how that actually performs. It's like, well, the web server went down for a minute. Okay, whatever. We don't care. It just doesn't matter, or hey, we dropped a couple of requests, or like, it's just whatever, it's fine. And then on the data side, it's interesting is there's kind of the flip where a lot of these problems, there is no right answer. It's just, you crunch some data and just the result you get is what you get. And you don't know, there's not an algorithmic solution. There's not like it's 2 + 2 = 4. It's like, well, the trend line is up and to the right. It's like, okay, how steep? We just, it is, well, it's just what the data is. And so that has, on that side, the, correctness is harder to define. And then sometimes on the engineering side, it's more important. So like I said, I did a small project for a company that makes heart monitors. And so some of the questions I like to ask when I'm doing data projects is like, are we allowed to drop data on the floor? Sometimes that's just an engineering compromise that makes things easier. And so you go to somebody who's doing web analytics and you're like, yeah, we missed a few clicks, whatever. And then you talk to somebody who's monitoring a patient's heart and they're like, we can lose no data at all. And that contrast is interesting to me between stuff on the web where like you can in theory get it right, but you don't have like totally right, but you don't have to. And then on the data side, where there is no definitely right answer, but it's got to work perfectly. And so how do you resolve? I don't know. We're still figuring it out. And so that's what it keeps it interesting for me, is like I like I like being able to go in and help people solve their problem and build them a platform that they can kind of continue to grow their business and iterate on. And I kind of go do it for somebody else. So, over the course of like long experience, and I don't know if I'm any better at anybody else than this. I've just been doing it a long time, and I've made the mistakes, I think, and to kind of spread that knowledge around and kind of apply it to a bunch of different situations has been interesting for me.
And going back to Python itself, what are some of the aspects of the language or its overall ecosystem or the community which you feel are either lacking or they don't receive enough attention, and that we should be spending more focus on and more energy on either improving or filling any technical gaps or anything along those lines?
Sure. So it's interesting to me the growth of the language over the last, let's say, 5 years. The language itself, I think, has become almost not unmanageable. I mean, because the core Python team is continuing to put out releases, but as a user of the language, I can't keep up anymore. So I knew Python 2.7 inside and out, like inside and out. And with the transition to 3, I didn't really start using it on projects till maybe like 3.5. And by that point, there was so much new stuff in there that I feel like I had kind of lost touch a little bit with all of the new features. And just as the community of committers to Python itself has gotten larger, I feel that like problem is accelerated. And I've talked to other people, who've been around for as long as I have, and they're kind of in a similar boat. It's just we're like, wait, what's going on? Or like, and it's particularly as they move to faster release cycles, it's like, wait, there's all this crazy new stuff in typing. And, I was just looking at the release notes for the upcoming 3.8 release, and multiprocessing is now going to support shared memory communication between processes, in addition to kind of just piping and copying data back and forth. I'm like, this is a game changer. Like, that's a huge technical innovation. And it's got like, a 1-sentence bullet point in the change log. And so how we get better at keeping the user community moving along with advances in the language itself, I think, is still a challenge, as the pace of innovation increases. I don't have a good answer for that. The other thing, in terms of as a community, at PyCon this past year, I heard there was a lot of fretting about the challenges of sustainability in open source, and just that, maintainers are getting burned out and there's no good funding model. And I'm not entirely sure what problem funding will solve, to be honest. And I'm kind of unusual that somebody getting, I mean, I guess everybody likes money, but I just, somebody getting a couple $100s a year is not going to make the difference between are they able to support doing a project or not. So like, what does sustainability look like in this space? And honestly, the biggest challenge I heard of is about project and product management. And so as a community, we've gotten really good at onboarding new developers and bringing new people in as contributors. And there's like a lot of best practice that people put together. We've all gotten really good at writing documentation. And I think Eric Holscher and the folks that read the docs have done a great job and just showing it's important to us and giving us a platform we can do on that. And I think the next big challenge is project management. I talked to a bunch of people who are maintainers of popular projects, and they're like, I spend all my time doing ticket triage. We get like 800 bug reports a year, and I got to go figure out which of these actually need to be addressed, and then like manage them through the workflow, reproducing cases. And that's something I don't think we know how to do ourselves, and we certainly don't know how to teach it. And I think that's kind of coupled with people want to work on their own projects. I mean, I'm guilty of this as much as anybody else. And I think this is a broader cultural thing, is that you get credit or you get a promotion, or like, people want to see their name up on the web. And, you don't get that for being just having your name in the changes file. You get that for being, like the inventor of whatever, like the inventor of date utils or whatever it is, like these major libraries that people use. And I don't know. I think we, as a consequence, are reinventing the wheel a lot in the open source space. And then, the people who do sort of accidentally wind up with their hobby project becoming critical infrastructure just overwhelmed. And I don't know how, I mean, like I said, I probably could personally do a better job of supporting other people's projects instead of working on mine. And I think that's something maybe we all need to think about.
And then, as somebody who has had these different shifts in your career, going from trading to the web to data engineering and being involved in the community and follow along in these different industry trends, what are some of the currently evolving trends, or any that you see as being upcoming, which you're keeping a close eye on? And how do you anticipate them influencing the direction that you take in your career and the direction that the broader community might trend towards in the coming years?
Sure. So definitely, like we talked a little bit about Python for everyone. Um, that more and more people who might have been spreadsheet jockeys are now learning to program, or people who did data entry are now learning to automate parts of their job. And so I'm looking forward this year to doing some training, some classes here in Pittsburgh on just kind of like not teaching people to program, but for people who have a little bit of basic experience, maybe did an online class and are looking to level up their game, or for people who know pandas but not Python. I feel like there's a lot of people who are coming from R, have gone through a data science boot camp, can use some of these science libraries, but just, in terms of structuring code, classes, how the object system works under the hood, data cleanup and processing. I'm looking to, just as both a career thing and just kind of spread my knowledge to do some teaching on that. I'm also this year going to be writing a book called Principles of Data Engineering with Addison Wesley, about covering that, just not specific technologies, but data software engineering practices as a whole. So those I think are going to be big trends. I mean, just the continued growth of data is astounding to me. Is that, I mean, it just, every sales organization on earth is going to turn into a data organization. It's just that this is going to allow us to answer questions more specifically, and kind of with like, as opposed to just kind of sticking our finger in the wind and being like, I think we should go to New York. It's like, okay, like, are people buying in New York? I think it's going to be a really big trend. And then, like I said, the IoT space, like physical computing, is going to continue to really develop. And that's interesting, super interesting to me. One of the handouts at PyCon in the swag bag this past year was a Circuit Python, which is a microcontroller made by Adafruit that you can now run Python on everything from like supercomputers or these huge, 1,000 node clusters down to a $5 chip with 256K of RAM or whatever. And it's the same language. Is super cool. It's super cool. And just, yeah, there's this saying from, the early 2000s that software is going to eat the world. And I think that's largely played out. Is that, software has kind of invaded all of these different spaces. And from where I sit, it feels like Python's about to use software. Is that if you're a college student today, that 5 years from now, if you're going out and starting a project, whether that's a startup or like a hobby project or an art project or whatever, odds are your first tool you're going to reach for is going to be Python. And that's really exciting for me as somebody who's been involved in this community for so long. Is that I think it's going to make a lot of things possible. Outside of that space, I'm always kind of keeping an eye out for new languages and new technologies. Rust looks really interesting to me as a programming language. I know there's a bunch of kind of experienced Python folks I've been working with are like really, really getting into it. Yeah, we'll see.
And since you are living in Pittsburgh and engaged with the community there, and that's where PyCon is going to be for the upcoming 2 events, what are some of the things that people who are attending the conference should know about the area?
It's great. We just had a meetup this past week with the event coordinator, the like PyCon planner from the Python Software Foundation, and Emily Morehouse, who's the conference chair, coming up for the next 2 years, where they were going to be in town to go visit the convention center. And they're like, hey, we want to meet with the community. When is your meetup? And I was like, you just tell me when you're coming, and that's when we'll have a meetup. And so it was great. We had maybe about 30 people come out, maybe only 5 of them had been to a previous event. And so people were interested in attending, volunteering, and just, we're really hoping to be good hosts. And, I moved here from Chicago about 5 years ago, and it's been a wonderful place to live, but it's not obvious in some ways. Is, like 3 years ago when it was in Portland, like Portland is just an easy place to go have a conference. I mean, it's just, there's food trucks, there's breweries, it's just like super easy. Pittsburgh is a wonderful place, but it's a little subtle. And so I'm interested in trying to help meet people's human needs as conference attendees, just to recognize that we're more than just butts and seats with a laptop. And so we are looking to do everything from, provide guidance on like local restaurants, bars, coffee shops, and stuff like that. There's a fantastic fine arts scene here, a number of like world-class museums within walking distance of the convention center, including a 7-story museum just for Andy Warhol. It's like a 5 or 6 minute walk away. Kind of giving people advice on transit. I know, like, when I go to travel to conferences, I always try to make sure to get out of the conference hotel or like the conference zone, is because, like, when else are you going to be in Atlanta, or when else are you going to be in Dallas or whatever? And beyond that, in terms of conference content itself, for people who haven't been, it's really a wonderful event. It'll be about 3,500 people. The event is capped at that size. I mean, they could sell more tickets, but they're kind of deliberately keeping it small. There's like 2 days of tutorials beforehand, 3 days of conference proper, including like, I think it's 5 or 6 parallel tracks, including what they call PyCon Charlas. Charlas is the Spanish language, is Spanish for conference talk. And so it is a full track of talks in Spanish. I'm just like, I can't believe it's just amazing to me. And then, afterwards there's 4 or 5 days of sprints where all these people who are in town for this event and work on open source projects get together and hack on things for a couple days. So if you want to if you want to sit with the core committers of Django and like work on some Django patches, or you want to work on CPython itself, like it's an opportunity to do that. And then beyond that, there are what are called hatchery events. And so PyCon's like a very progressive conference in terms of just being open to all the kind of weird stuff, interesting stuff people want to do. And so last year there was a traditional performing arts about the experience of programming. So plays, spoken word. I had a bit part in one of the plays playing the role of a web API, which was hilarious. And so, they've now formalized the process for doing these interesting things. And it's called the Hatchery program. And so I know some of the things that are getting proposed is me and some friends are proposing a gallery style installation on computational art. There's talks about a data science specific track. And we'll see what else comes up. But those proposals are due in a couple of weeks. The CFP for conference talks proper, I think closes in just a few days. So you should get on it if you haven't. And then if you can't make this conference, there's a whole bunch of regional events. So I attended both PyOhio with Columbus and PyGotham in New York, and they're like little mini PyCons and are also kind of really great way to participate. And I'm always looking forward to the hallway track. And so that is an event in and of itself of just people. There's lots of space to sit and drink coffee and just meet people and kind of find out about interesting stuff. That's really kind of a core part of the conference for me.
Are there any other aspects of your experience of working in Python and with the community that we didn't discuss yet that you'd like to cover before we close out the show?
I think one of the things is, people will come back to me and they'll be like, why just Python? Like why only language and why just Python? And so for me, some of that was just being, I think, in the right place at the right time. But I love this language for its simplicity. It's just, this is runnable pseudocode. If you and I were to get out a whiteboard and just rough out an algorithm, that's going to look like what runnable Python code is, pretty close. And so I joke that I'm not smart enough for other things. Like I'm not smart enough to do Java. I'm not smart enough to do Scala. I'm definitely not smart enough to do Haskell. And that the problems I'm trying to solve are pretty difficult, and having a language that's easy to work with and fits my brain makes doing those harder things possible. And I think that's part of what's contributed to its just general growth, particularly among people who are coming into later in their careers that don't have formal training, is that it's easy. It's an easy language to get started in. And then the community is great. And I mean that both in terms of the technical ecosystem, like the number and quality of packages is incredible to me. And then the people. I just continue to meet wonderful people and people who just kind of really care about what they do. And that's just really inspiring to be around.
For anybody who wants to get in touch with you and follow along with the work that you're doing or hire you from your consultancy, I'll have you add your preferred contact information to the show notes. And with that, I'll move us into the picks. And this week, I'm going to choose the Matomo Analytics platform. It's an open source and self-hostable alternative to Google Analytics. I've been using it for the podcasts for a while now, and it does a pretty good job of being able to track the data and have some usable reports. So for anybody who's looking for something to be able to track traffic on their applications, it's definitely worth a look. And so with that, I'll pass it to you, Pete. What do you have for picks this week?
My pick this week would be Fast API, which I have been using on a couple projects recently. It's a Flask-style RESTful API and just really, really a pleasure to work with. It's backed by a data layer called Pydantic, which makes modeling requests and responses in different formats, and packing and unpacking JSON are really trivial. And so it's easy to say, hey, I want to switch this from passing arguments and query parameters to passing them in the body of the function. And it has kind of nice integration. So no RRM, but you can back it with any data layer. It's got like nice integration with SQL Alchemy, and it's both very fast, as the name might expect, works with async IO, and just really been a pleasure to work with. And it's just kind of been nice to just bang these things out. So I'd recommend people check it out.
All right. Well, thank you very much for taking the time today and sharing your experiences working in Python and the trajectory that it has taken for your career. So I appreciate all of your time and effort on that front, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to check out our other show, the Data Engineering Podcast, at dataengineeringpodcast.com for the latest on modern data management. And visit the site at pythonpodcast.com to subscribe to the show, sign up for the mailing list, and read the show notes. And if you've learned something or tried out a project from the show, then tell us about it. Email hosts@podcastinit.com with your story. To help other people find the show, please leave a review on iTunes and tell your friends and coworkers.